London sleeps, but Whitechapel does not. It is 1:45 a.m. on September 30th, 1888. A damp fog hangs low and thick, softening every edge. Gas lamps burn pale amber, and a light drizzle slisks the cobblestones until they shine like dark glass. A lone constable turns off Mitre Street and steps into Mitre Square, a small pocket of shadow where sound seems to travel reluctantly. He is not looking for history. He is looking for trouble, and for someone who might be freezing in the rain. What he finds will change the city's nights for generations, and one question will haunt every investigation that follows. How does a killer vanish from a sealed square in minutes, leaving almost nothing but damage behind? The square is nearly silent. A distant set of horse hooves fades into the fog. A shutter creaks somewhere in the tenements beyond. The constable's boots scuff lightly as he crosses open ground, his breath visible for an instant. Before the mist swallows it, in the weak reach of a lamp, the stonework glistens. In that glow, a doorway appears like a cut in the wall, a dark entry that should be empty at this hour. He angles toward it anyway, routine in his bones, eyes trained to pick out motion. Then the night gives him a shape on the ground that does not move. At first, it reads as a collapsed figure, the kind of human bundle the East End produces by the dozen. But the closer he gets, the more the scene refuses to explain itself as mere drunkenness. The coppery tang of blood reaches him before the details do. Under the lamp's circle, Catherine Eddowes lies in the entryway. Her throat has been cut from ear to ear with a precision that feels practiced. Her torso has been opened, the mutilation deliberate, intimate, and brutal. The constable's breath catches, not as performance, but as the body insists on the reality of what has happened here, seconds or minutes ago. This is not just murder. It is work. The kind that takes nerve in the open air and time measured in breaths. The drizzle beads on leather and stone. The air is damp, but the body gives off a faint heat. A cruel reminder of how recent this is. The constable steps back, pulls himself into procedure, and signals for help. In the fog, sound turns strange. A muffled cry rises from a nearby street, then dies, as if the city itself is trying not to wake up. If the killer is still close, he is close enough to hear the alarm. So how is he already gone? Within minutes, the square starts to fill. Footsteps gather, then stop. Faces hover at the edge of the lamp's reach. The mechanical click of equipment, the shuffle of boots. Fall when everyone understands what they are looking at. In 1888, the police do not have modern forensic science waiting in a kit. They have eyes, notebooks, and the fragile order of a cordon made from bodies and authority. Every second matters, because every second matters contamination, rumor, and spectacle. In this neighborhood, a crowd is not just a crowd. It is a force that can erase a trail as easily as it can create one. And here is the twist that turns fear into panic. This is not the only scene tonight. Around 1 a.m. in Berner Street, Elizabeth Stride is found killed with a single fatal wound. For a moment, there is a dangerous hope that the killer was interrupted, that maybe the pattern has broken. But Mitre Square erases that hope in an instant. 2 murders in one night. The public will call it the double event, and the phrase will spread faster than the facts. The question now is not whether there is a predator in Whitechapel. The question is how often he can do this and how little time he needs. Mitre Square is not a labyrinth. It is contained, bordered, watched by windows and corners. That is what makes it terrifying. The killer had to enter, do what he did, and leave without being grabbed. In the fog, he could be a shadow slipping behind a lamppost, or a man walking calmly past another officer with a steady face. This is where the modern obsession begins, not with a name, but with an escape. If he can disappear from here, he can disappear from anywhere. And the police, already stretched thin, are about to be measured by the one thing the city demands most: certainty. The horror in Mitre Square does something else too. It exposes a fault line in Victorian London, a metropolis that celebrates progress, railways and industry, and a district where poverty, crowding and desperation make life precarious. Catherine Eddowes is not just a body in an entryway. She is a woman the city has already trained itself to overlook. That is part of the killer's advantage. He hunts where vulnerability is common and where night work blends into the background noise of survival. The murders do not only reveal a predator, they reveal the social conditions that let him move unseen. News travels before dawn. By morning, inquests, postmortems, and newspaper print will begin grinding the details into public imagination. The police will catalogue wounds and reconstruct minutes. The press will amplify dread with every new line of ink. And somewhere in the noise, letters will soon appear, claiming a killer's voice, daring authorities to catch him. But right now, in this square, the story is simpler and more terrifying. A constable stands in the fog, staring at the evidence of a skill he cannot yet explain. If this was done quickly, then speed is part of the method. If it was done calmly, then calm is part of the monster. The fog will lift later, but the uncertainty will not. Mitre Square becomes the moment the city understands it is facing a pattern: intimate violence, anatomical precision, and a killer who works inside narrow time windows. Tonight's discovery will pull investigators backward to earlier scenes and forward toward a final escalation still months away. We began with one constable stepping into a lamp's weak circle of light. We end with a new kind of fear, one that spreads across streets and newspapers alike. The open question remains, and it will steer everything that follows. Who was close enough to do this and ordinary enough to walk away unnoticed? Before there was a name for the killer, there was a place that made him possible. Whitechapel after midnight is a geography of narrow lanes, wet cobbles and weak light. Gas lamps burn with a tired amber flicker, leaving long stretches of shadow between pools of visibility. In those gaps, people move quietly, not because they are criminals, but because they are trying to get through the night without being noticed. Here is the first open question that will follow us. In a district this crowded, how can someone repeatedly kill and still vanish as if the street itself swallowed him? Daylight does not solve Whitechapel, it just reveals it. Tenements lean over the street like tired shoulders. Courtyards are packed with lines of washing and the smell of coal smoke. Families share rooms that were never meant to hold that many bodies. When money runs out, so does privacy, and then safety becomes a luxury. In this neighborhood, the threat is not only violence, it is exposure, eviction, hunger, and the quiet math of what a person will do to afford a bed for one more night. The killings will be described as mysteries, but the setting is no mystery at all. It is a place where hardship is ordinary and attention is scarce. This is where the lodging house becomes a central character. For a few pennies, you can buy a bed in a packed dormitory, or less than that for a place to sit, head forward, sleep stolen in a chair. It is cheap, it is noisy, and it is temporary. Men and women shuffle in at all hours, some working nights, some looking for work that will not come, some trying to disappear. The system trains you to live without leaving a trace. And that is the twist. A neighborhood built on transient survival also makes it easier for a stranger to blend into the human current and go unseen. But the street is not only misery, it is also a working ecosystem. Hawkers call out in the morning. Market stalls open early. Women scrub steps and wash clothes. Children carry messages and small parcels. People here know one another by face, not by name. They recognize a gait, a hat, a cough. That is why the Ripper story will always feel impossible, because if everyone is watching everyone, the killer should not be able to pass, unless what looks like community is really something else, a crowd that is too exhausted to intervene, too used to minding its own danger, and too aware that attention can bring trouble instead of help. So the next question is sharper. What does it mean to be seen if nobody is protected? At night, the economy changes. The same streets that sell vegetables by day turn into corridors of negotiation after dark. A woman can be alive, talking, and then gone. And it may not register as an emergency. In Whitechapel, a raised voice is not always a crime. It can be an argument, a drunk, a couple, a customer who will not pay. The city trains itself to filter noise. That filter becomes the killer's camouflage, a brief struggle, a muffled cry, footsteps that quicken, and then the street returns to its ordinary rhythm. Here is the pattern break to remember. The most terrifying advantage is not a weapon. It is the way the neighborhood has been conditioned not to respond. Policing in Whitechapel is not a single force with a single plan. It is patrols, beats, whistles, and routine. Constables walk fixed routes, expected to be visible, expected to deter, but deterrence assumes the city is readable. Whitechapel is not. Streets interlock like a maze, and the borderlines between districts and jurisdictions complicate response. Even a disciplined patrol can miss what happens in the minute between one corner and the next. The Ripper's method, when it emerges, will look like a kind of timing. Not just brutality, but scheduling. And that raises another hook. If the killings happen inside narrow windows, is the killer studying the police, or is he simply benefiting from the way the system already moves? Listen to how information travels here. Not through official channels first, but through doorways and stairwells and the morning queue at the lodging house desk. One person hears a rumor, 10 people repeat it, and by noon it becomes a story with details that never existed. The press will soon exploit that speed, printing fear at scale. But in 1888, the first draft of the Ripper legend is spoken, not written. A killer becomes a phantom because the neighborhood needs an explanation that fits the feeling of being hunted. And now another twist. The more the story spreads, the more it teaches the killer what the city thinks it knows. Whitechapel is also a district of outsiders, and that matters because fear always looks for a target. Immigrants, the poor, the visibly different, anyone without protection becomes a convenient suspect in the public mind. It is easier to blame a stranger than to admit the killer may look ordinary. The streets encourage profiling because people are desperate for certainty. Yet certainty is exactly what the case will not provide. That is the pattern break that keeps returning. The hunt for the Ripper often becomes a hunt for someone society already wants to punish. And in that distortion, the real trail can cool. So what happens to the women living at the edge of shelter? The ones who cannot always pay for a bed. The ones who move between rooms, alleys, and acquaintances. In a place like this, a woman can become less a person and more a problem to be managed by institutions that offer little mercy. That is the darkest truth beneath the mythology. The victims are vulnerable not only because of one man with a blade, but because the city has already decided whose suffering is normal. This is where our early question begins to resolve. How does a killer vanish in a crowd? He vanishes because his targets have been socially edited out of importance. When someone is trained to be overlooked, the person threatening them is easier to overlook too. And then, in that environment, the murders begin to land like thunder on a roof that was already leaking. The city will soon argue about suspects, letters, and methods. But before any of that, the ground truth is simple. Whitechapel is built to endure hardship, not to prevent it. Gaslight creates shadows. Lodging houses create anonymity. Exhaustion creates silence. Put them together, and you get a killer's ideal working conditions. In the next chapter, we follow how those conditions turn into a timeline, how a first body shifts from local tragedy to national obsession. The question that remains is the one that should have been asked from the start. When the first woman is found, who decides whether it is just another East End death or the opening move of a pattern? Before London can name him, before newspapers can sell him, the story begins with a different question. When the first woman is found, who decides whether it is just another East End death or the opening move of a pattern? In Whitechapel, that decision is made in minutes, on a street that most Londoners will never walk. It is the early hours of Friday, August 31st, 1888. Bucks Row is narrow, quiet, and working class, bordered by brick walls and the hard geometry of an industrial city. The night shift is ending. Men walk with their heads down, thinking about sleep, wages, and the long day ahead. Then a shape in the darkness forces one of them to stop. A woman lies on the ground, partly turned, skirts disordered, the street too still around her. At first, the moment can be misread. A collapse. Drink. Another hard night in a hard district. That is the first danger in this case. How quickly the mind reaches for ordinary explanations when the victim is poor. But the closer the witnesses get, the less ordinary it looks. In the gaslight, the injury is read as deliberate. A throat cut. Violence that does not belong to a random scuffle. And in that instant, the street changes character. It stops being a route home and becomes a scene. And here is the first open loop that will haunt every murder after this one. How does someone do this on a public road and leave without being caught? The police are summoned into a neighborhood where authority is often resented and often needed. A constable arrives, then another. The street fills with the controlled chaos of first response in 1888. No crime scene tape, no floodlights, just boots on wet stone, a whistle, and the uneasy sense that the killer had a head start measured in minutes. Mary Ann Nichols is identified. She is a woman in her early 40s, robust, dark-haired, shaped by years of precarious work and precarious shelter. This is the part of the story the mythology skips. Not a symbol, not a headline, but a human being moving through the East End's narrow options. And the pattern break is this. The killer does not choose a mansion street or a private garden. He chooses the places where disappearance is already normal. Now the machinery of the era turns. A police inquiry begins, and an inquest will follow. But the tools are limited. This is late Victorian London, where modern policing exists, yet modern forensics does not. Investigators rely on timing, on witness statements, on routes through the maze. The killer, meanwhile, has something else on his side. Whitechapel's anonymity, lodging houses, shared stairwells, dozens of men moving at the same hours, dressed alike in the dark, and then the story leaves Bucks Row and enters the newspapers. This is where a local killing becomes a national fixation. The press senses a narrative, the public senses a threat, and the police feel the pressure rise. The stakes shift fast. It is no longer only about one dead woman. It is about whether London can protect its most exposed residents. Rehook this question now, because it will decide everything that comes next. Was Nichols an isolated tragedy or the first clear note in a repeating rhythm? As investigators and residents search for certainty, suspicion follows the oldest path. The stranger, the foreigner, the man who looks wrong in the dark. In Whitechapel, people are desperate for a shape to put fear into. But the case resists that comfort. The most unsettling possibility is also the simplest. The killer may look ordinary. He may belong to the same streets, the same crowds, the same routine. If that is true, then the city is not hunting a monster outside the community. It is hunting a man inside it, By dawn, Bucks Row has done what Whitechapel always does. It absorbs shock and keeps moving. Work resumes. Doors open. The dead are counted and the living keep bargaining for a bed. But a line has been crossed. The first canonical victim has been found, and London has begun to suspect a pattern. Near the end of this chapter, one piece of that early question becomes clearer. A killer can vanish here because the neighborhood itself is built for vanishing, and now the real suspense arrives. If Nichols is the beginning, what does the second murder reveal that the first could not? Whitechapel is still counting the cost of Bucks Row when the calendar flips and the streets do what they always do. They refill, they darken, they make strangers look alike. And in that noise, a killer discovers his advantage. Time, because in this district, minutes stretch. A shout can vanish into tenements. A footstep can dissolve into a market lane. The question hanging over every patrol is simple and terrifying. If the first murder was a pattern, what does the second one teach the killer about getting away with it? Annie Chapman is one of thousands living on the edge of rent, food and warmth. A lodging house bed is not a home, it is a nightly negotiation. In the small hours, the East End becomes an economy of last chances. A penny for a bed. A few coins for breakfast, a stranger who seems polite enough to trust for one more hour. Here is the open question that will haunt the investigation. Did Annie die because she was targeted, or because she was simply available in the one window the killer knew he could control? The geography matters. Hanbury Street sits close to the pulse of Spitalfields, where early market life starts before sunrise. That means foot traffic, carts, voices, and opportunity for cover. And then there is number 29, a narrow yard, hemmed in by buildings, a space that can hide violence for long enough to finish it. It is a killer's kind of room, outdoors but enclosed. Private, but not quite. The police will later chase routes and timings, but the first clue is simpler. The murderer is choosing places where the neighborhood itself acts like a screen. Before dawn, this street is in its in-between state, not fully asleep, not fully awake. A few people move with purpose, most keep their eyes down. Somewhere in this window, Annie is last seen alive. And this is where the story turns, because for a murderer, a busy district is not a risk, it is camouflage. That is the pattern. Break Whitechapel refuses to accept at first. More people can mean fewer answers, and it sets up the next investigative crisis. If witnesses are everywhere, why is the killer still invisible? The discovery is sudden and oddly domestic in its first impression. A resident steps into the yard area at number 29 and sees what looks like a brutal assault. Blood. Stillness. Belongings disturbed, but as people gather and the police arrive, the scene refuses that easy explanation. This is not rage that spills and stops. It is controlled harm, done quickly, with a confidence that suggests the attacker knew how long he had. Here comes the rehook. The case cannot escape. How does someone do this and leave before the street fully wakes up? News travels faster than any constable. Within hours, the neighborhood knows a second woman has been murdered. And the press recognizes what the police dread. Two killings do not feel random. They feel serial. In late Victorian London, the system can photograph a face and catalogue a criminal, but it cannot read DNA, cannot lift reliable fingerprints, cannot time death with certainty. Investigators are pushed back onto the oldest tools. Who saw her? Who heard something? When did the street change from quiet to active? The killer has built his method around those uncertainties. In the hours after the discovery, Hanbury Street becomes a corridor of statements. People describe fragments. A sound here, a stranger there. A brief exchange. But fragments are not a suspect. They are a fog of human memory, shaped by shock and hindsight. And in that fog, suspicion finds the easiest targets. The outsider, the poor, the immigrant, anyone who looks wrong under gaslight. The police need something more concrete, but the street keeps offering only what it always offers, conflicting voices and short glimpses. The open loop tightens. If the killer is ordinary, then every ordinary man becomes a possibility. The timing window is the battlefield. Hanbury Street sits near an area that stirs early, and that means the murderer is racing the city's own schedule. The killer is learning how to operate inside that schedule, not outside it. He does not need an empty street. He needs a street that is busy enough to hide him, and distracted enough not to look twice. This is the investigative twist. The more pressure the police apply, the more the killer benefits from the routines of poverty, shared yards, narrow passages, lodging house churn. Whitechapel is not just the setting. It is the accomplice the killer never has to meet. Now the case shifts from one murder to a developing signature. The second killing intensifies the fear because it suggests escalation and confidence suggests repetition. Patrols increase. Public meetings demand action. The police are forced to act in public, not just investigate in private. But visibility is not victory. If anything, it advertises the hunt. Another pattern break hits the story here. Whitechapel's fear does not slow the streets down. It speeds them up. People rush. People gossip. People misremember. And somewhere inside that acceleration, the killer understands he is not being chased through empty alleys. He is being hidden by crowds. By the end of this chapter, one early question begins to answer itself. Nichols was not an isolated tragedy. A second woman has been murdered in a space that should have been risky, and the killer still escapes. That means the murderer is not simply lucky. He is choosing. Choosing streets with exits. Choosing moments when the city is half awake. Choosing victims who cannot afford protection. But the larger question stays open, and it is the one that will pull us into the next turn of the story. If the killer can do this twice and learn from each time, what happens when he decides to strike faster, closer together, and with even less time to spare? Inspector Frederick Aberline arrives in Whitechapel with a reputation that should calm a district like this. He knows the streets. He knows the lodging houses. He knows the lodging houses. He knows how quickly rumor becomes fact when people are frightened, but the question hanging in the air is not about his skill. It is about time. How many mornings can pass with another body before London decides the police have lost control? And in that race against the city's patience, one uncomfortable mystery sits at the center of everything. If the killer is striking inside tight windows, what does he know about the patrols that the public does not? The inquests begin to turn murders into public theater. A dead woman becomes a timetable. Witnesses become unwilling narrators. And every answer creates 3 more questions. Because an inquest is not just an investigation. It is the state speaking in front of a crowd, trying to sound certain while standing on evidence that is fragile, partial, and often contaminated by the very attention the case attracts. Whitechapel listens for reassurance. Instead, it hears details. Streets, times, cuts, distances. The killer is learning too, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. Aberline's practical problem is brutally simple. Whitechapel is not one crime scene. It is a maze of shared stairwells, crowded yards, and alleyways that pour into one another like veins. Lodging houses churn people through the night. Men move between pubs and work and doorways. Women move between desperate choices. A killer does not need to vanish into emptiness. he can vanish into normal life. And that forces a kind of policing that looks powerful on paper and weak on the street. More boots, more whistles, more lanterns, more eyes that still cannot agree on what they saw. Then comes the pressure from above and from below at the same time. Newspapers demand an arrest. Residents demand safety. Politicians demand competence. The police respond in the most visible way they can. Patrol patterns tighten. Men are posted at corners, and yet visibility has a cost. The killer is not blind. If he is watching routines, every public adjustment teaches him where the gaps have moved. Pattern break. The hunt itself becomes part of the killer's environment, like the fog and the gaslight, something he can use. Inside the inquest rooms, witnesses try to fix a moving night into a single story, but memory is slippery under fear. Times drift. Distances bend. A man seen near one doorway becomes two men. Then no man at all. This is where the case starts to fracture into versions. Aberline has to decide what the public cannot, which details are signal, and which are the noise of a neighborhood living on the edge of exhaustion. Rehook. If the killer can count on confusion, what happens when he chooses a place where confusion is guaranteed? And while the police chase statements, the city begins to chase a name. The murders are discussed in pubs, markets, stairwells, and print. Every conversation recruits a new suspect: foreigners, butchers, doctors, lodgers, anyone who walks alone. The fear spreads laterally, not logically. It becomes a social epidemic. For Aberline, this is not just atmosphere, it is an investigative hazard. Because the more people guess, the more the killer is protected by the sheer volume of wrong certainty. Aberline tries to pull the case back to what can be measured. Roots. Timing. Where a man could walk in minutes without being noticed. Where he could wash. Where he could store a knife. This is the unglamorous work behind the myth. Not a single brilliant deduction, but a grinding attempt to make a city behave like evidence. Pattern break. The more the investigation becomes about geography and time, the less it feels like a whodunit and more like a war over movement. And in that war, the killer keeps winning by seconds. The city's demand is always the same. Why can you not stop him? But the police are fighting with late Victorian tools. No modern forensic databases. No instant communication. No reliable way to preserve a scene once the crowd arrives. A murder site is not sealed, it is absorbed. Strangers step closer. Neighbors point. Reporters take notes. Evidence becomes story before it becomes proof. Rehook. If this is the environment, then the killer is not only escaping the police, he is escaping into the way London works. Still, something does begin to clarify. Not the face of the murderer, but the logic of the murders. They are not random in place or time. The killer is choosing moments when the city is half awake, when laborers start to move, when the streets carry enough life to provide cover. That is the partial answer to the question at the start. He does not need silence. He needs routine, and routine is predictable, which means, in theory, it can be trapped. But theory is not what the public wants. The public wants a man in handcuffs. By the time Aberline has absorbed the witness statements and the inquest rhythms, Whitechapel is no longer waiting for the next clue. It is bracing for the next body. The police can feel it. The killer can feel it. The killer can feel it. And the city is about to learn that fear does not always slow a predator down. Sometimes it pushes him to prove he is still ahead. If the murderer's timing himself against patrols and crowds, then the next move is not to strike again. It is to strike faster, closer. With less time to spare, at about 1:45 a.m. on Sunday, September 30th, 1888, a lone constable returns into Mitre Square and walks into the kind of silence that feels staged. Damp fog clings to the gaslight. A light drizzle slisks the cobbles. Then the lamp's pale circle finds her, Catherine Eddowes, on her back near a doorway, throat cut from ear to ear, her body opened with a purpose that reads as both skilled and unhurried. In that instant, Whitechapel stops being a neighborhood in crisis and becomes a city-wide emergency. But the question that will haunt the next hours is simpler than any theory. How can there be two scenes on one night and almost no time in between? Rewind less than an hour and the geography changes everything. Berner Street sits east of the city, a working-class artery where clubs, lodging houses and narrow yards compress strangers into each other's space. Around 1:18 am, Elizabeth Stride is in that world, a Swedish immigrant surviving on the margins. The killer does not need a perfect hideout. He needs a brief pocket of routine, a gateway, a shadow, a moment when footsteps pass and do not stop. And tonight, that moment arrives. Stride is found in a yard off Berner Street with a single catastrophic injury, her throat cut. And then, something that should be impossible for this case happens. The mutilations that defined the earlier murders are not there. No escalating violence, no signature that the public has learned to expect. For investigators, this is not a mercy. It is a warning. Either the killer is changing or he was interrupted. And if he was interrupted, the most dangerous question comes next. What does a predator do when his ritual is cut short? Pattern break. Imagine the killer not as a phantom, but as a man suddenly out of time. If Stride is a disrupted murder, then the cock starts the moment he steps back into the street. He is now carrying urgency instead of patience, and Whitechapel is full of narrow lines that pull you toward the City of London, toward darker pockets where patrol patterns change and jurisdiction lines create seams. The police are not chasing one moving target. They are chasing a moving target through two different police forces. This is where the double event becomes more than a headline. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police are separated by boundaries that matter in paperwork, patrol routes, and communication speed. In 1888, there is no instant broadcast, no shared radio channel, no citywide alert system that locks down streets in minutes. Information travels by messenger, by foot, by whistle, by rumor. A man crossing a boundary at the right time is not just escaping a constable. He is slipping between systems. Rehook. If Stride was interrupted, then the second scene is not a separate crime. It is the continuation of the first, and that means the killer had to find another victim, another location, and enough privacy to do what he came to do, all in a vanishing window of minutes. That is not luck. That is familiarity. Whoever he is, he knows where darkness gathers and where patrols thin out. Back in Mitre Square, the constable's discovery turns a quiet corner of the city into a shockwave. The injuries to Catherine Eddowes are unmistakably more severe than Stride's, with a throat cut and the body grotesquely opened. The contrast is the clue. If Stride is an unfinished act, Eddowes is the release of what was delayed. And it suggests a chilling possibility. The killer is not slowing down under pressure. He is accelerating. He is proving he can still do it, even with the streets alive around him. Pattern break. For the public, 2 murders in one night feels like a monster multiplying. For detectives, it feels like a timetable. Someone is working inside the rhythms of Sunday morning streets, when laborers stir, when pubs empty, when night patrols repeat their routes. The killer is not just choosing victims, He is choosing the minutes between other people's movements, and the more the police map those minutes, the more terrifying the math becomes. He is operating inside windows so small that a wrong turn by a constable could be the only difference between life and death. Investigators now face a double crisis. 2 crime scenes, 2 sets of witnesses, 2 crowds eager to trample through the details. In 1888, a murder site is not preserved. It is consumed. Neighbors step forward. Passers-by point. Reporters arrive, and every new pair of boots risks wiping away the few physical traces that might have mattered. The killer benefits from this, not because he controls the crowd, but because the crowd controls the story faster than the police can control the evidence. Near the end of this night, one unresolved question sharpens into strategy. Was Elizabeth Stride truly a Ripper victim, or a different killing that only looks connected because of timing? The single wound makes doubt possible, but the second scene makes coincidence harder to believe. Here is what the double event forces onto the table. If the same man did both, then interruption does not stop him. It redirects him. And if interruption redirects him, then the next time the police get close, he may not retreat at all. He may simply move faster, pick a tighter corner, and vanish into the scene between patrols again. The city is about to learn what it means to chase a killer who treats time like a weapon. Mitre Square is almost empty at 1:45 a.m. A damp fog hangs low, and a light drizzle turns the cobbles into mirrors for the gas lamps. A City of London policeman turns into the square, expecting nothing but quiet. Then the light catches a body in a doorway. Catherine Eddowes lies on her back, throat cut from ear to ear, her abdomen opened with a violence that feels practiced. In that instant, the Ripper is no longer a rumor running through Whitechapel. He is a presence that can strike inside the city itself, then vanish. And an urgent question snaps into focus. If the killer could do this here, inside a square with regular patrols, what does that say about how close the police have already come without knowing it? The location is a cruel twist. Mitre Square sits in the City of London police jurisdiction, not the Metropolitan Police, and that boundary matters. Different leadership, different patrol patterns, different paperwork. In a modern investigation, a line on a map should not protect a killer. In 1888, it can slow everything down. Messages move by runner, not radio. Orders arrive late, and while officers coordinate across districts, crowds begin to gather. Boots step near blood, faces lean into lamplight, trying to see what they should not see. Evidence is not sealed. It is breathed on, argued over, and carried away in the form of rumor. This is the double event night. Earlier, around 1000 a.m., Elizabeth Stride is found in Berner Street with a single deep cut to the throat. No abdominal mutilation. That one difference has haunted investigators ever since, because it opens the door to doubt. Was Stride the Ripper interrupted before he could continue, or was she killed by someone else and the timing only mimics the pattern? But in the shadow of Eddowes in Mitre Square, coincidence becomes harder to accept. If Stride was the first attempt, then the Ripper did not stop. He simply moved and finished the night elsewhere. Here is the rehook. If interruption does not end his ritual, what does it change about the next one? To understand the speed, you have to imagine the clock as a weapon. The night is segmented by pub closings, shift changes, and the steady loop of patrols. The killer is not just picking places, he is picking gaps. The murder of Eddowes happens within minutes of a constable's pass through the square. It means the attacker either watched the patrol rhythm or learned it through repetition, or had a comfort with risk that borders on contempt. Pattern break. The Ripper myth is often built on mystery, but here the reality is logistics, a narrow window, a controlled burst of violence. then a quiet exit into fog. After Mitre Square, the killer's escape becomes a second crime scene, drawn in reverse by investigators trying to find the scene he slipped through. The streets here funnel toward narrow passages and doorways. Somewhere in that maze, a piece of evidence appears not at the body, but along the route away from it. Part of Eddowes' clothing is later found, suggesting the killer carried it for a time and discarded it when he had to. That detail changes the emotional temperature. It suggests he did not just flee, he managed his exit. He made decisions under pressure, and the police are forced to ask whether he was alone in those minutes, or whether he blended into people who did not realize what had just brushed past them. The newspapers race the police. Headlines do not need certainty, only heat. Each edition turns fragments into narrative. Butcher, surgeon, madman, foreigner, local. In the East End, suspicion spreads faster than any official notice. A man with a satchel becomes a story. A stranger's accent becomes an accusation. The press frenzy is not just background noise, it changes behavior. Witnesses reinterpret what they saw. People come forward with details shaped by what they have read, and in a district already strained by poverty and overcrowding, the fear begins to look for a face to blame. Rehook. When a city is desperate for an answer, how do investigators separate the killer's trail from the public's panic? October arrives and something shifts, not because the police relax, but because the killer does not strike again. Patrols intensify. The streets feel watched, but the silence does not bring relief. It sharpens dread. Every night that passes without another murder becomes its own kind of suspense, because the previous pattern suggests the next attack will come when attention starts to drift. Pattern break. The most frightening part is not what the police can see, it is what they cannot measure. If the Ripper is gone, why? If he is still here, what is he waiting for? And if he is learning, what will he change the next time he acts? Then the story narrows to a single room. Miller's Court, off Dorset Street, is not a square and not a thoroughfare. It is a tucked-away pocket of poverty, where sound does not travel far, where a scream can be swallowed by thin walls and exhausted neighbors. Mary Jane Kelly lives there. She is younger than the other canonical victims, and she has something they often did not: a private space behind a door. That detail matters because it offers the killer time, and time is what turns a murder into an exhibition of control. The open loop returns, sharper now. If the Ripper could kill in a patrolled square, what would he do in a room where no patrol can see him? On the morning of November 9, the door to Kelly's room becomes a boundary between normal life and the worst discovery of the entire series. Those who come to check on her do not find her in the street, they find her inside, in a confined space where the violence has nowhere to dissipate. The mutilation is extreme, more sustained, and more devastating than what came before. Investigators and doctors confront an uncomfortable possibility. The killer may have escalated because the environment finally gave him privacy, not just minutes, but time. Not just an alley, but a room. Rehook. This is the moment where the case stops being about chance encounters on dark streets and starts looking like a killer who understands opportunity. After Mary Jane Kelly, the city does not exhale. It stiffens. The murders have reached a peak that makes every earlier theory feel inadequate. The police have names of suspects, descriptions from witnesses, and piles of statements shaped by fear, but none of it locks into a single, provable identity. And the deeper tragedy is that the victims, real women with histories, are repeatedly pulled into a public argument as symbols instead of lives. The open loop pays off, but not with comfort. Interruption did not stop the Ripper on the double event night. Privacy empowered him at Miller's Court. So the last question of this chapter is the one that drags the story forward. Did the killer stop because he chose to, because he had to, or because the city simply lost sight of him in the noise it created? After Mary Jane Kelly, the murders do not end with a capture. They end with a silence. Whitechapel stays crowded, the streets stay wet, and the fear stays mobile. Police files thicken. Patrols expand. Inquests conclude. But no arrest stitches the story shut. The question that hangs over everything is simple and unbearable. Did the killer stop because he chose to, because he had to, or because London could not see him anymore? Then the letters arrive, or keep arriving, depending on who you believe. Handwritten messages flood police desks and newspaper offices, each one offering a voice for a man nobody can reliably describe. The most famous names, like Dear Boss and From Hell, become the public's substitute for evidence. But investigators face a problem that still haunts the case today. In a city addicted to headlines, how do you separate a killer's words from 1,000 imitators desperate to be part of the story? Here is the twist. Even if one letter did come from the murderer, it does not solve the murders. It solves the branding. A name appears, and it spreads faster than any patrol can walk. Jack the Ripper. The press prints it. The public repeats it, and suddenly the killer is not just a criminal in Whitechapel. He is a character, a signature, a modern boogeyman with a stage name. The case shifts from catching a man to chasing a myth that can write itself new endings. And while the public reads, the police work in a world without fingerprints, without DNA, without reliable blood typing. They have eyewitness accounts that conflict. Timelines measured in minutes, a maze of courts and alleys where anyone can vanish into a doorway. Their best tools are legwork, informants, and intuition. That limitation matters because the absence of a conviction is not proof of a master criminal. It may be proof of an error not yet equipped to trap him. Now the suspect names begin to harden into legend. Druitt, Kosminski, Ostrog, Maybrick. A list that grows with each decade, not because new evidence appears, but because the mystery invites projection. Each suspect becomes a mirror for the fears of the people naming them. The foreigner. The doctor. The case files never deliver the one thing history demands, a single chain of proof that taught pattern break. Step away from the killer and look at what his shadow did to the city. Whitechapel becomes a symbol in the national imagination. A place that respectable London can blame for its own discomfort. The murders are used to argue about poverty, immigration, policing, and morality. The victims are flattened into cautionary tales. And the most devastating legacy is this: a woman's life is reduced to the way she died, because a city finds it easier to study monsters than to confront the conditions that made her vulnerable. So what did the police actually have? They had time windows, they had geography, and they had a pattern that seemed both disciplined and chaotic. A killer who could move fast, strike quietly, and disappear into crowded streets. But here is the next question that keeps the case alive. Was this one man, or did the label Jack the Ripper become a basket that held multiple crimes? The files cannot answer cleanly, and that uncertainty is exactly where the myth learns to breathe. A century later, the case is reopened again and again, not by Scotland Yard, but by culture. Authors, criminologists, and filmmakers return to the same streets with new lenses. Archives are reread. Old testimony is reweighed. Modern theory is poured into Victorian gaps. And each return produces a new conclusion that feels convincing until you ask the only question that matters. Can you prove it the way a court would have to prove it? Rehook. If the killer could not be caught, Why does his name still feel closer than the names of the women he killed? Because Jack the Ripper is a perfect modern myth. Anonymous, portable, and endlessly customizable, he is the fear of the city condensed into a single silhouette. The letters, the suspects, the debates, all of it forms a machine that keeps producing new versions of him. Meanwhile, the real people at the center of the story risk being erased by the spectacle built around their deaths. The legacy, then, is not a solved identity. It is a warning about what happens when violence meets mass media, when poverty meets indifference, and when a mystery becomes entertainment. The Whitechapel murders forced London to look at its own underside, and then taught it how to look away, by staring at a name instead. The case ends where it began, in a gap between light and shadow. A fog-clotted street, a police whistle, and a question